Quote, "It is certain that the ancient Romans were Negroes or Ethiopians. For the most distinguished families at Rome were Ethiopian, and one of them, the family of the Scipios, which eventually rose to the imperial dignity under Augustus, was always acknowledged by themselves and by the Roman people to be of Negro origin. One of the Scipios was styled Afar, which indicates his country, and his descendants were distinguished by the surnames of Niger and Ethiops, which marks them as black men. The whole of Italy was peopled by the Negroes and the Ethiopians, who immigrated from Egypt under the conduct of the sons of Mizraim, or Menes, the Greeks and the Celts or Gauls being then savage and uncivilized." Unquote, from Godfrey Higgins, Anacalypsis. The fact is that the Romans were a nation of Negroes, and that the history of this wonderful people is lost in the night of time. Even at the present day, as we have seen, the whole of the south of Europe, and especially Spain, is full of Negroes, and there are thousands of them in India. It is certain that the ancient Romans were Negroes or Ethiopians, for the most distinguished families at Rome were Ethiopian. It is well known that the Moors, who conquered Spain, were Negroes, and that they were preceded by another set of Negroes, the Celtae, who had previously penetrated to that country from India. These Celtae are, in fact, the same as the ancient Britons or Welsh, who have also a tradition that they came originally from India. The ancient Persians were also Negroes, as we have seen, and the Indian epics are full of references to the wars between the white and black races." Unquote. Godfrey Higgins, Anacalypsis. The different species of the Negro variety appear to have been scattered over the face of the earth from the earliest times. The black hue of the Ethiopians is mentioned by Homer and other ancient writers, and it seems probable that the Egyptians were a colony from Ethiopia. The fact is that the Romans were a nation of Negroes, and that the history of this wonderful people is lost in the night of time. We find the Roman Empire, from its commencement to its fall, in the hands of Negroes. The most celebrated of the Roman historians, Tacitus, informs us that many of the most distinguished families at Rome were of Ethiopian origin. The great nation of America appears to have been originally Negroes, like the inhabitants of the greater part of Africa. This seems to be proved by the form of the American skulls, by the features of the American nations, and by their languages. The chief nations of America were quite black, and the whole of the practices of these nations are those of a people in the very earliest state of barbarism." Unquote, on page 421. The architecture of America, like its religion, is similar to that of Africa and Asia. But how came these resemblances? May it not be from America having been originally peopled by Negroes or Indians, who had originally come from Asia or Africa? May not America have been originally a colony from the Old World? How came the first inhabitants to cross the Atlantic? May it not have been done by means similar to those by which the original inhabitants passed from the Old to the New World? May not the original inhabitants have come from the northeast of Asia to America by means of Bering Strait, and by a different route from the one by which the Eskimos came from the north? I am inclined to think that there was a communication between the Ethiopians and the Americans before the latter were discovered by Columbus. In the wonderful ruins of Central America, there are the strongest traces of an Asiatic or African origin. The same peculiarities which we see in the architecture of the ruined temples, and which is called Gothic or Saracenic, we see in the ruins of Thebes and in the caves of Elephanta and Ellora in India. The religion of Central America was the same as that of Egypt, and the priests of Mexico were Negroes, and clothed like those of Egypt. The Emperor of Mexico was a Negro, as were also his judges and counselors. Unquote. Volume 1, page 431. The ancient Peruvians were a nation of blacks, and the descriptions which have been given of them agree perfectly with those of the Ethiopians. They had a system of government nearly resembling that of the ancient Ethiopians, Their social state and their manners and their customs appear to have been the same. The government of the Incas was monarchical, and nearly the same in all respects as that of the Ethiopians, except that the Inca was not permitted to have several wives. They had a law that no one should reign who was not of the royal blood. The Inca was looked upon as a sacred person and was addressed as the son of the sun. The Peruvians had no letters. They recorded events by means of knots on strings, which were called quipas. Unquote. Page 437, Volume 1. The nations of America were probably colonies of the great nations of Ethiopia and Africa. Unquote. On page 438. On page 469 he says, there is no doubt that the people of America were originally Negroes, or nearly approaching to it. Unquote. Quote, I am not able to say whether the dark race were the original people of America or not, but I have shown that it is probable that they were so. Unquote. On page 479. Quote, the Ethiopians and the people of the New World, who were blacks, appear to have been colonies from the same great nations. Unquote. Page 485. Quote, I have no doubt that the Americans were originally Negroes and that the ancient Ethiopians and Americans were one and the same people. Unquote. Page 488. Quote, the ancient Americans, like the Hindus and Egyptians, were dark or black. Unquote. Page 446. Quote, the Mexicans, like the people of India and Ethiopia, were originally Negroes. Unquote. Page 487. Quote, I am inclined to think that America was first peopled from the Old World by Ethiopians or blacks. Unquote. Page 492. Quote, the ancient people of America were a branch of that great race of the Ethiopians or blacks who, in ancient times, inhabited both the Old and the New World. Unquote. Page 510. Quote, the people of America appear to me to have been originally Negroes from the same great stock as the inhabitants of Ethiopia and Hindustan. Unquote. Page 421. If I may, I would like to give some other information that corresponds with Godfrey Higgins. The evidence is overwhelming that the Americas were settled by black people from Africa, Asia, and Europe. The fact that so many black people in America have accepted the story of their own inferiority is a tragedy that has to be overcome. We must reclaim our history. Unquote. Ivan van Sertima, author of They Came Before Columbus. I agree with Higgins that a number of ancient nations were of the black race. Unquote. Count Constantine, François de Chesseboeuf, French traveler and writer. The people of the Americas in remote antiquity were unquestionably black. The complexion of their skin has been described in various ways, from a light brown to a deep black, but it is generally agreed that their skin was darker than that of the Mongolians and that the people of ancient Egypt. Unquote. W.E.B. Du Bois, American sociologist, historian, and civil rights activist. Several quotes here. The Mayans were also black, and their civilization was no less advanced than the Egyptian or Ethiopian. Unquote. Chancellor Williams, an American historian and author of The Destruction of Black Civilization. Quote, I am convinced that there is a direct connection between the ancient civilizations of the Americas and Africa. Unquote. Ronoko Rashidi, African historian and scholar. Quote, there is ample evidence that the ancient Olmecs of Mexico were an African people. Unquote. Clyde A. Winters, African-American historian and anthropologist. Quote, there is much evidence to support the view that a black, African, or Negroid presence existed in prehistoric America. Unquote. Paul Alfred Barton, African-American anthropologist and historian. Quote, the African-American can and should reclaim his rightful place in world history. The evidence is there for all to see. unquote. John Henrik Clark, African American historian and scholar. So I advise anybody to go and dive into this book. We're going to continue to do so. I just wanted to give some quick quotes about what was known and what's always been known for a very long time until it got changed up. The more you look into the etymology of Ethiopian and the fact that it didn't mean a country, it meant a type of skin just like swarthy. When you look into the aspect that they spoke of a East and West Ethiopia, or Ethiopians, it all meant Negroes, okay? It meant dark melanated people. And you just gotta understand that. And the more we open ourselves to understanding our history, the more we're able to move forward into an enlightened state. I love you all. Peace and blessings.